Imagine the dense, shadowed forest at twilight. The kind of forest where the trees seem to lean closer to you, whispering secrets that no one should hear. It starts with a calm breeze brushing against your skin, carrying the faint scent of pine, damp earth, and something else. Something you can't quite place. Your steps crunch against the leaf-littered floor, and for a moment, it feels peaceful. This is the deceptive calm that the deep woods always have, lulling unsuspecting travelers into a false sense of security. But in the deep woods, darkness isn't just the absence of light. It's a living, breathing entity. And tonight, it has stories to tell. Our first story takes us to a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. Locals there always warned outsiders about the old logging trail, a path forgotten by time and shunned even by the bravest hikers. Jacob, a thrill-seeker with a camera, dismissed the warnings as old superstitions. He wanted footage, something raw, something that could go viral. As he set foot on the trail, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest seemed to swallow him whole. Every sound, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, distant animal calls, felt amplified, reverberating inside his chest. He pressed on, convinced his excitement was just nerves. Yet the deeper he went, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if warning him to turn back. An hour into his hike, Jacob heard it. A faint scratching, rhythmical, almost deliberate, coming from behind a cluster of ancient oaks. He froze. The camera shook in his hands as he turned, but there was nothing. Only shadows stretching unnaturally across the forest floor. He laughed nervously, telling himself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. But the scratching didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, faster, closer. Panic began to seep in, but curiosity and maybe foolishness kept him moving forward. That's when he saw it. Footprints in the mud, large, uneven, claw-like, leading parallel to the trail, but then vanishing into the thick underbrush. His heart pounded, sweat forming on his brow as he debated whether to follow or run. Against his better judgment, he followed. What he found made him wish he had never taken that step. A clearing, small and oddly symmetrical, with stones arranged in a circle. In the center, a tree, gnarled and twisted, its bark stripped as if clawed by something enormous. And then, the sound hit him again, directly behind him. Turning slowly, Jacob saw eyes reflecting the faint moonlight, impossibly high up in the trees, fixed on him. They were too large, too numerous, and they blinked in unison, unnervingly. He ran, camera swinging wildly, branches slapping against his face. He didn't stop until he reached the trailhead, gasping for air. The sound of his own heartbeat deafening compared to the silence of the forest behind him. Later, when reviewing his footage, there were frames he didn't remember filming, shadows moving with intent, fleeting glimpses of figures half seen, watching, waiting. Some things in the deep woods don't just observe, they remember. Our second story is quieter, more sinister in its subtlety. Claire and her friends decided to camp along a remote river bend in the Pacific Northwest. The air was crisp, the river a silver ribbon reflecting the early night sky. At first, the trip was idyllic: laughter, marshmallows roasted over a fire, stories told under a blanket of stars. But as night deepened, a heavy fog rolled in, settling like a shroud over the forest. The sound of the river became muted, distant, and the familiar crackle of their fire seemed inadequate against the encroaching darkness. Claire was the first to notice the footprints, small, human-like, surrounding their campsite. There was no sign of anyone else, and the prints didn't lead away. They stopped abruptly, as though the forest itself had swallowed them. As the night pressed on, whispers began. Low, guttural, just at the edge of hearing. At first, it seemed like the wind, rustling through the dense undergrowth. But then, the words became discernible. Names. Her name, her friends' names, whispered with an intimacy that made the hairs on her neck rise. Panic set in as they realized the whispers came from every direction. They packed hurriedly, but the fog had thickened enough for twisting familiar trails into mazes of uncertainty. And then, from the fog, shapes began to emerge. Thin, elongated silhouettes that flickered in and out of visibility. Their movements unnatural, jerking like marionettes on invisible strings. Every time they thought they were alone, the shapes multiplied, circling, never approaching directly, yet always close enough to see the glint of pale eyes. Hours later, they stumbled upon a ranger station, empty and cold. When they described what they had seen, the local ranger's face turned pale. He told them of the fog walkers, entities that the indigenous tribes of the region had spoken of for centuries. Silent spectral watchers who prey on those who linger too long in the forest at night. Claire and her friends left, never speaking of the trip publicly. But the footage on their phones told the full story. Shadows slipping between trees, whispers that seemed almost to form faces, eyes that reflected terror back at them. The deep woods, it seems, keep secrets that no one should uncover. Our third tale comes from the thick, misty forests of northern Michigan, where hunters often disappear, and locals speak of a creature they call the Wendigo. Sam, an experienced outdoorsman, went on a solo hunt in late October, drawn to the allure of solitude. His first few days were uneventful, filled with the usual sounds of wildlife and the crunch of leaves underfoot. But on the fourth day, he found strange marks etched into the trees. Deep gouges, circular, arranged with disturbing precision. That night, the wind carried more than just leaves. It carried screams, distant yet unmistakable. He dismissed them as animals at first, but then the whispers began, soft and unintelligible, threading around the trees like smoke. By morning, he discovered his campsite had been rearranged, his tent slightly off-center, and the food he had stored gone, replaced with rocks arranged in a disturbing pattern. Sam followed a trail he hoped would lead him back to familiar terrain. But the forest seemed alive, shifting, trees subtly changing positions when he wasn't looking. And then he saw it, a shadow larger than any human, hunched and moving in ways that defied natural locomotion, with eyes glowing faintly amber in the moonlight. He ran, stumbling, falling, every step echoing as if the forest itself was laughing. When he finally reached his truck at dawn, he found claw marks etched into the door, deep enough to suggest immense strength. No one believes his story, of course, until they see the footage he captured. Fleeting glimpses of a monstrous figure, watching from the tree line, always just beyond clear sight, yet undeniably present. And as the night grows deeper, the forest seems to whisper again. Maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe the stories are already inside your mind, making the shadows stretch longer than they should, making every rustle feel like intent. The woods are patient. They remember everyone who dares enter, and they are always hungry for more. In the heart of the deep southern forests, where Spanish moss drapes like ghostly veils over gnarled oaks, lies a road few dare to travel after dark. Locals call it Widow's Pass, named after a tragic tale that no one dares fully recount. But those who drive its winding curves at night often report something chilling. Headlights flickering, figures appearing on the roadside, or the unmistakable sound of sobbing that vanishes the moment you stop to investigate. Lena, a college student returning from a late-night study session, took the scenic route home despite warnings. The evening was calm, the kind of warm, heavy air that hangs over the forest like a blanket. She sang softly along to the radio, trying to push away the creeping unease. As she rounded a bend, her headlights illuminated a figure. A woman, pale, dressed in tattered black, standing motionless in the center of the road. Lena braked, heart hammering, but when she looked again, the figure was gone. Shaking, she thought it must have been a trick of the light or a passerby disappearing into the tree, but then came the sound, soft at first, a sobbing echoing from both sides of the road, growing louder, closer, yet impossible to pinpoint. Her car seemed to slow, though she was pressing the gas, her hands white on the wheel. A shadow passed over her windshield. Just for a moment, enough to see eyes. Empty, hollow, filled with grief and something far older, something hungry. She swerved onto a side path, tires crunching over gravel, desperate to escape. But the sobbing followed. By the time she reached the main highway, the sound stopped, leaving only the silence of the forest, oppressive and absolute. Weeks later, Lena would still hear the sobbing in her dreams, as if Widow's Pass had marked her, and the road would always call her back, even in her sleep. Far to the north, in the dense pine forests of Canada, there is a tale hunters whisper but never discuss openly: the story of the silent stalker. It begins innocuously enough: a hunting trip, an early morning mist, the crisp scent of pine and snow. Michael, a seasoned hunter, was tracking deer when he noticed something odd. All the animals were gone, leaving the forest unnaturally quiet. No birds sang, no rustling of small creatures, nothing but the occasional creak of branches. It was a size. It's a silence that felt deliberate, suffocating, as if the forest were holding its breath. Hours later, Michael heard it. A soft crunch behind him, distinct from the natural sounds of the forest. Turning, he saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched intensified, prickling his skin. The sun began to dip, and shadows stretched in impossible directions, bending around trees unnaturally. Then came the sound: soft, deliberate footsteps, not following a human pattern, but a cadence that made his heart race in terror. He ran, adrenaline surging, yet every path seemed to loop back on itself. Finally, as darkness enveloped the forest completely, he caught a glimpse. A shadowy figure, elongated, thin, moving silently behind the trees. Its eyes, faintly reflective, never blinked. He barely escaped, but the memory of that gaze, the silent stalkers, haunted him long after he left the forest, a reminder that some predators do not hunt for food, they hunt for fear. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Northwest, there is another story that blends urban legend with the unshakable dread of the deep woods. On a foggy November night, a group of friends decided to explore an abandoned logging camp, rumored to be haunted by the spirits of loggers who died in tragic accidents. The camp was eerily intact. Rusted tools lay in their original places, shanties sagged with decay, and the surrounding forest pressed in from all sides, making it feel like the trees themselves were closing ranks. They laughed nervously at first, telling ghost stories while their flashlights cut through the thick fog. But laughter faded as one of them, Tyler, noticed scratches along the walls of the main shack. Deep, haphazard yet oddly patterned, like tally marks counting something unspeakable. Then came the knocks, soft at first, a rhythmic tapping, growing louder, more insistent. When they opened the door to leave, the forest outside had changed. Trails that led to safety hours before now twisted back upon themselves, impossibly rearranged. Shapes moved just beyond the light, flickering in and out, their forms humanoid but grotesque, with limbs bent at unnatural angles. The friends fled, but not before one of their cameras captured the truth. Figures emerging from the fog, reaching out as if drawn by their presence. Their faces obscured, but full of silent rage. When they shared the footage later, the scratches, the sounds, and the shadowy forms were undeniable. And it was not just a story. to scare friends on a foggy night. The logging camp had been abandoned long before any of them were born, yet the forest held its own residents, patient, angry, and eternal. Even deeper in the woods of New England, there's a chilling tale told in hushed tones by hikers along the Appalachian Trail. A young couple, Emma and Luke, were traversing a remote section late in September, eager to witness the fall foliage. The forest was alive with colors: crimson, amber, gold. But under that beauty lurked a darkness they couldn't see. On their second night, camped beside a serene stream, they awoke to a noise unlike anything they'd ever heard. A low, resonant hum vibrating through the ground, emanating from the heart of the forest. It was not animal, nor wind, nor human. It was something else entirely. They followed the sound in the morning, curiosity overtaking fear. The forest grew thicker, branches intertwining so densely that light barely touched the floor. Then they saw them. Hundreds of small carved figures, almost lifelike, scattered in patterns along the forest floor, each one depicting a person in agony, frozen in mid-motion. Emma's stomach churned as she noticed the details. Faces twisted in terror, eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams. And then the humming began again, louder, seemingly from everywhere and nowhere. They ran, the forest closing in as if resisting their departure. When they finally reached the nearest town, locals spoke of a forest that remembers, a place where intruders are not forgotten, where the very trees might be recording your fear for eternity. And yet, for all the horror, there is a strange, hypnotic allure to the deep woods. It's not just the fear that draws people in. It's the promise of mystery, the challenge of surviving where others have failed, and the undeniable beauty that hides unspeakable secrets. Every creak of a branch, every glint of moonlight through the canopy, every distant howl is a reminder that the forest is alive, watching and perhaps judging. Those who leave may carry the memory of the deep woods forever, but those who stay or stumble too far may become part of its stories, whispering through the leaves to the next curious traveler. In the remote forests of Oregon, where the mist clings to the trees like a living shroud, there is a tale of a lone camper named Daniel. He was an experienced outdoorsman, confident in his ability to handle the wilderness. But the forest that night had other plans. Daniel had set up camp near a riverbank, the water reflecting the moonlight in silver streaks. It was silent, too silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves, which he dismissed as small animals. But as the night grew darker, he noticed something odd. Footprints, large, humanoid, but impossibly long strides, leading around his tent in a circular pattern. Daniel's heart raced as he followed the prints, flashlight cutting through the fog. They seemed to vanish at the edge of the river, only to reappear moments later, closer than before. Then came the sound of snapping branches, slow and deliberate, coming from multiple directions at once. He turned quickly, shining his light into the forest, but saw nothing. Yet, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist, humanoid but distorted, limbs bent at unnatural angles, its face obscured by shadow. Daniel froze, unable to move, and the figure simply stared. After what felt like an eternity, it vanished into the fog. He fled, leaving his campsite behind. But the prints were there the next morning, circling the spot where his tent had stood, an unspoken warning carved into the earth. In the Appalachian wilderness, there's a story about family hiking along an abandoned trail known for its eerie history. The Johnsons, parents and 2 children, were drawn to the isolation, believing the forest would offer peace away from the bustle of city life. But by the second night, the peace turned into paranoia. Their tent was surrounded by strange symbols etched into the trees, runes or markings that didn't resemble anything known. When Mr. Johnson investigated, he discovered deep scratches on the trunks, some so fresh they bled sap like open wounds. At first, they tried to dismiss it as the work of animals or pranksters. But then the noises began. Whispers carried on the wind, murmurs of voices speaking in a language that seemed almost familiar but twisted and wrong. The family tried to leave at first light, but the trail seemed to shift, paths twisting in impossible directions. Their compass spun wildly, failing to point north, while the forest grew denser, darker, and oppressively quiet. By noon, they stumbled upon a clearing filled with more symbols, arranged in a pattern that suggested a ritual of some kind. At the center, they found small effigies made of wood and cloth, each resembling one of them, eyes crudely carved and staring into nothingness. Terrified, they fled, eventually finding the nearest road. But the feeling of being hunted never left. In the heart of the Canadian Rockies, there's a chilling tale of a hiker named Elise, who went in search of solitude and returned with a story that defied logic. Elise had been trekking through an unmarked trail for hours when she noticed a clearing with a small decrepit cabin. It appeared abandoned, its roof sagging and windows shattered. Curiosity got the better of her and she entered. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but there was something else, an overwhelming presence, as if the cabin itself were alive. On the walls were crude sketches depicting human figures in contorted positions, faces twisted in silent screams. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Elise's heart pounded as she tried to open it, but it was stuck fast. Then she heard the whispering, soft at first, almost comforting, then growing louder, more insistent, surrounding her from every angle. The air felt heavy, pressing against her chest. She screamed, pounding on the door, and finally it gave way. When she ran outside, the forest had changed. Familiar trees seemed alien, shadows moving in impossible ways. Elise escaped the mountains, but the whispers followed her, returning in dreams, always asking, always waiting. Meanwhile, deep in the forests of the Midwest, there is a story of a man named Tom who went deer hunting with his brother, unaware of the malevolent presence that awaited them. On the second day of the hunt, Tom heard rustling behind him in the underbrush. Thinking it was an animal, he turned his rifle and saw a figure. A man, or at least it appeared human, crouched unnaturally low, with eyes that reflected the sunlight in a way that was impossible. The figure didn't move like a human. It slithered, almost gliding across the forest floor. Tom froze as it raised its head, revealing a face that was half human, half something else, mouth stretching impossibly wide in a silent grin. They ran, but the forest seemed to conspire against them. Every turn they took led them back to the same clearing, where the figure waited, more of them appearing with each pass. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, gasping and covered in scratches, they realized their watches had stopped, clocks showing hours that didn't exist, as if time itself had bent. Sighed the woods. Tom and his brother never returned, their disappearance becoming another chapter in the whispered tales of hunters who vanish without a trace, swallowed by the living, watching forest. In the dense forests of Northern California, there's a story of hikers encountering something known locally as the Hollow Man. Legend says that anyone who wanders too far into the backwoods might see him. A gaunt figure, unnaturally tall, with skin that seems to shimmer with the colors of the forest, blending in until he chooses to reveal himself. Anna, a backpacker, came across the Hollow Man while following a trail off the beaten path. At first, she thought it was a trick of light, the sun filtering through leaves. But the figure moved in a way that no human could, gliding over rocks, passing through underbrush without breaking a branch. The Hollow Man stared at her for what felt like hours, though she knows it was likely minutes. Every instinct screamed to run, but her body froze. She eventually broke into a sprint, glancing back to see the figure vanish, only to realize it had followed her silently, keeping pace despite her speed. Anna escaped the forest, but the sense of being hunted persisted. Months later, she would find leaves and twigs arranged in patterns on her doorstep, as if the Hollow Man remembered her, marking her as one who trespassed into his dominion. Even in the heart of urban proximity, forests carry their own secrets. In the outskirts of Maine, near an abandoned logging town, there is a story of teenagers who went camping as a dare. They set up tents near a creek, laughing and drinking, unaware that the forest had been observing them long before their arrival. That night, one of them, Jess, awoke to a whisper in her ear. "Leave now." She assumed it was one of her friends playing a joke, but the whisper came again, growing colder, more urgent. When the group tried to leave, the forest seemed to change, paths twisting, streams rerouting, as if the land itself were alive. They eventually stumbled upon the remains of a long-forgotten settlement. Charred wood, rusted tools, and bones, both human and animal, scattered among the undergrowth. From that night onward, they were haunted by sightings. Figures glimpsed from the corner of the eye, shadowy shapes moving between the trees, and whispers that spoke in no known language. Jess swore she could hear the forest calling her name, even weeks later when she returned to her everyday life. The lesson was clear. The woods remember, and trespassers are never truly free. In the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, where the nights are long and the darkness absolute, there is a story of a survivalist named Eric who sought solitude but found something far more sinister. Eric had chosen a secluded valley, surrounded by dense spruce and towering pines, with snow already starting to dust the ground. He thought he was prepared. A sturdy tent, supplies for weeks, and a sense of confidence honed by years of outdoor experience. But by the second night, he began to feel a presence, an oppressive weight pressing on him even through his insulated walls. At first, he heard the crunch of snow underfoot, distant but deliberate, not like a wandering animal. Then came the whispers, not carried by the wind, but emanating from the trees themselves, as if the forest had voices of its own. Eric tried to rationalize. Wind in the branches, small wildlife, perhaps even his own imagination playing tricks. But the whispers grew louder, forming words he couldn't comprehend, sharp and jarring in their cadence, as if mocking his very presence. His flashlight flickered, then died, leaving him in absolute darkness. Eric ventured outside, relying on memory and the faint moonlight. And that's when he saw them. Figures, humanoid in shape, but taller and impossibly thin, standing silently among the trees. Their eyes glowed faintly red, fixed on him with predatory focus. He ran, heart hammering, snow and ice shredding his boots as he stumbled through the forest. No matter which direction he went, the figures seemed to anticipate his every move, appearing just beyond his vision. Silent hunters of the night. Eric eventually escaped to a ranger station hours away, but the images of those figures, their eyes, and the whispers have haunted him ever since. In the forests of Vermont, a group of campers experienced something they can never fully explain. 4 friends had set out to enjoy a weekend away from the city, pitching tents in a remote area known for its natural beauty and tranquility. By the second evening, the laughter and camaraderie had faded into unease. They began hearing footsteps circling their campsite, But whenever they shone their flashlights toward the source, nothing was there. Then came the sounds of low, guttural humming, a vibration that seemed to penetrate bone, felt more than heard. One of them, Mark, decided to investigate the source. He followed the sound deeper into the forest and discovered a series of shallow depressions in the earth, each arranged in a pattern resembling concentric circles. In the center of the largest depression was a small, charred effigy of an animal carefully placed. As Mark leaned closer, the humming stopped, and a cold wind swept through, extinguishing his flashlight. In that instant, he felt a presence behind him, though he couldn't turn to see it. The group fled back to their campsite, only to find the effigies had multiplied, now surrounding their tents in silent accusation. They left immediately, leaving behind their belongings, vowing never to speak of what they had encountered. Deep in the forests of New Mexico, there's a chilling account of a young man named Javier who went in search of solitude and stumbled upon an abandoned mine. The mine was hidden in a canyon, overgrown with brush, yet unmistakable in its dark entrance, yawning like a mouth ready to devour him. Despite the warnings of locals about the area being haunted, Javier ventured in, flashlight in hand. Inside, the air was thick and musty, carrying a metallic tang. As he explored, he noticed scratches on the walls, symbols etched deep into the rock, appearing to pulse faintly in the beam of his light. Suddenly, a distant sound echoed, a scraping, like metal on stone, approaching rapidly from the depths. Javier's flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, he saw shadowy figures darting along the mine walls, too fast to be human, too coordinated to be anything natural. He ran toward the exit, only to find the entrance had disappeared, replaced by solid rock. Panic set in as the scraping grew louder, closer, circling him. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed fractured, and he finally found a narrow tunnel that led him out, collapsing behind him as he emerged into the canyon's sunlight. The mine entrance never appeared again, as if it had never existed, leaving Javier buoyed to question his own sanity. In the remote forests of Pennsylvania, there's a story of a man named Leo who was bird-watching alone in an uncharted section of woodland. He came across a strange clearing, filled with stone pillars covered in moss and lichen. The pillars seemed ancient, their surfaces etched with markings that defied identification. As he examined them, he felt the air grow thick, heavy, almost viscous, and a low humming began to resonate from the ground. Looking up, he noticed shadowy forms moving between the trees, silent and fluid, never breaking the stillness of the forest, but always observing. Leo's movements grew slow, cautious, as if the forest itself was a living entity, aware of his every step. When he tried to leave, he realized the paths had shifted, the forest rearranging itself. Trees that were once behind him now blocked the way, while familiar landmarks had vanished. He spent hours wandering, though it could have been days. Time felt meaningless. Eventually, he stumbled back onto a familiar trail, but the forest seemed to breathe behind him, whispering in tones that unsettled the soul. Leo left the woods with an unshakable certainty. The forest remembers trespassers and punishes curiosity. In the Pacific Northwest, there's an account of hikers encountering something called the Wraith of the Pines. 3 friends were on a weekend trek when they noticed a figure moving high above them in the treetops. At first, it appeared to be a deer or another animal, but as they observed, the figure descended unnaturally, moving with a fluidity no human could replicate. It had long limbs, pale skin that shimmered like moonlight through mist, and eyes that reflected everything yet nothing simultaneously. The friends froze, unable to speak, as the figure seemed to study them, assessing, calculating, patient in its predation. One of the hikers, Elena, later described a sudden understanding, a sense that the forest itself was alive with consciousness and malice. When they finally escaped the area, she realized that small signs of their encounter persisted. Footprints that led nowhere. Twigs broken in patterns resembling ancient symbols, and an almost imperceptible humming in the air whenever she returned near that region. The experience left them shaken, with a lingering awareness that the forest is more than trees and wildlife. It is a sentient entity that remembers, observes, and waits. In Michigan, there's a tale of a family camping along a rarely traveled trail in the Upper Peninsula. By the 3rd night, the father, Mark, awoke to the sound of whispering in a language he didn't recognize. Stepping outside, he saw shadowy figures flitting among the trees, moving too quickly to be human, yet leaving impressions in the soil as if walking through solid ground. He woke his wife and children, and they attempted to leave, only to find their vehicle missing. Panic set in, and the forest seemed to twist, pathways looping impossibly, creating disorientation so extreme that even compasses spun uselessly. Eventually, they stumbled upon a clearing with remnants of old structures, half buried and crumbling, with symbols etched into the wood. The figures were still watching, silent and patient. The family fled on foot, exhausted and terrified, eventually finding the nearest road hours later. To this day, they claim the forest follows them in subtle ways. Twigs arranged on their doorstep, shadows flickering unnaturally at night. A constant reminder of what waits beyond the trees. The last story comes from the dense forests of Oregon, where hikers have reported encounters with something they call the silent stalker. A young couple, Anna and David, had ventured into a remote section of the forest to photograph wildlife. As dusk fell, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Birds stopped singing, insects fell silent, and the wind ceased entirely, leaving only a suffocating stillness. They heard nothing at first, then a faint crunch of leaves behind them. Turning, they saw nothing but a cold dread washed over them. Every step they took was mirrored by another sound just beyond sight. Shadows moved between the trees, always at the edge of their vision, too fleeting to focus on. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, only to reveal nothing. But the feeling of being watched intensified. Anna stumbled upon footprints, elongated, clawed, and unlike any animal they had seen. They followed the trail, hoping it led to safety. But it twisted unnaturally, looping them back to their starting point, the forest acting almost sentient. Suddenly, they saw it. A tall, gaunt figure with elongated limbs, its skin pale and eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It didn't move aggressively, but the presence was oppressive, ancient, and intelligent. Anna and David fled blindly through the forest, guided only by instinct, until they reached the trailhead hours later. They never spoke of what they saw again, but both report the haunting memory never leaves. Dreams filled with whispers, shadows, and the unshakable certainty that something waits silently in the deep woods, patient and eternal. The forest, with its towering trees, shadowed paths, and hidden corners, holds more than beauty. It harbors secrets and entities beyond human comprehension. For those who venture too far, the deep woods are not merely a place of nature, but a domain where the line between reality and nightmare blurs, and survival is never guaranteed.